Good afternoon. Welcome to yet another extremely topical and extremely timely AMIT webinar. On October 24th, 1945, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, during a moment of rare international moral clarity, the United Nations was formed. It was predicated upon lofty principles, including Article 51 of the UN Charter, which clearly discusses the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations. Unfortunately, the United Nations has fallen very far from the lofty principles upon which it was founded. During 11 days last May, over 4,300 missiles were lobbed into Israeli towns, cities, and communities from the terrorist group Hamas. Israel did what any nation in that situation would do. They defended its own people. However, in what can only be described as the Kafkaesque mechanizations of the United Nations, Israel is being placed on the docket as the defendant by the United Nations Human Rights Council, which is composed of such illustrious bastions of human rights as China, Russia, North Korea, Libya, Mauritania, and Venezuela. The United Nations Human Rights Council has voted to begin an ongoing independent investigation into Israel's conduct during the war. What this does is put the Israeli population and the state of Israel into the defense. What happened to the Israeli people is not even mentioned in the resolution, nor is the name Hamas. This is possibly, according to our renowned guest and legal scholar, Anne Bayesky, the most hostile anti-Israel inquiry in United Nations history. This inquiry's mandate is to investigate, quote, all alleged violations of international humanitarian law and all alleged violations and abuses of international human rights law leading up to and since April 13th, 2021, in what they call the Occupied Palestinian Territory, including East Jerusalem and all underlying root causes of recurrent tensions, instability, and protraction of conflict, including systematic discrimination and repression based on national, ethnic, racial, or religious identity. The consequence of this inquiry is an interminable assault on Israel, which can be used in criminal legal proceedings, such as the International Criminal Court, and will be used by those who want to further the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement to further isolate Israel within the community of nations. Now we are about to hear from one of the world's preeminent legal scholars and experts on how to respond to these outrageous allegations with very, very far-reaching consequences for the Jewish state. Anne Bayesky is the director of the Toros Institute on Human Rights and the Holocaust and a professor at the Graduate School of Jewish Studies. She received her Master's of Letters from Oxford University and recently served as a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. Here we go, excuse me 1 minute, a little problem here. She has authored many legal scholarly papers, and she has actually been the author or editor of 11 books and has taught at York University, Columbia University, and the University of Ottawa. And recently authored a brilliant study of this investigation for the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. And she not only spoke about the legal proceedings and the personalities involved, but what we can actually do about this. So it is now my esteemed honor to welcome you, Anne Bayesky. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. I would say that North Korea is not on the Human Rights Council.
Sorry.
It doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of others that are not exactly human rights role models. Cuba, Eritrea, Libya, Pakistan, Qatar, Somalia, Sudan, Venezuela, the list goes on. So I'm here to describe the current situation. And in my almost 40 years of following the UN human rights system, I can tell you without a doubt that this is the worst inquiry, investigation, operation ever launched by the United Nations against the state of Israel. Zionism as racism, of course, was a low point, but it wasn't operationalized in the same way as this particular effort. The Human Rights Council was called into action within days of the May conflict. Of course, it sits without doing anything for years in terms of many human rights abuses around the world, egregious situations. But in this case, within days, and in fact, after there was a ceasefire, they held an emergency session at the behest of Islamic states on the council and what they call the State of Palestine. They adopted a resolution in this environment where Islamic states hold the balance of power and non-democracies are the majority. And no Western state voted for it. But it was a setup because the resolution, which was in theory supposed to deal with the so-called emergency that had just emerged in May, did not deal with that. In fact, it has a very open-ended mandate, which is what makes it in particular so vicious and really antithetical to the cause of human rights. And one of the things it says is it decides to establish an ongoing investigation. The investigation has no end date. It is in perpetuity. Number two, it is all the human rights abuses of international human rights law and humanitarian law leading up to and since the 13th of April, 2021, which is not when the May conflict occurred. So what happened in April 13th and why did they pick that date? It's because it was the beginning of Ramadan and the allegations that Israel was responsible for the repression of Muslim rights. Jews were responsible for the oppression of Muslim rights. And it doesn't even say April 13th. It says leading up to and since April 13th. So it goes back in time immemorial, and it says that the inquiry is about everything in perpetuity. So it's really about an attack on the very existence of the state of Israel and the legitimacy of a Jewish state. The underlying feature of it is that it then goes on to talk about the mandate being all under the identification of all underlying root causes of recurrent tensions, protraction of the conflict, including systematic discrimination and repression based on national, ethnic, racial, or religious identity. So the idea is that Israel will become a global pariah for the allegation of racial discrimination, and in particular, of so-called apartheid. So the plan is this fantastically open-ended so-called inquiry has everything on the table from the beginning of time till the end of time forever to talk about Israeli violations of human rights. in international humanitarian law, or to draw a moral parallel occasionally between the IDF, which the United Nations has frequently, in fact, renamed the ISF, the International or Israeli Security Forces. They don't like the word defense, or sometimes they call it the IOF, the Israeli Occupation Forces. So the IDF is actually, even the nomenclature is being changed in many UN circles, but it's a moral parallel between Israeli self-defense and the terrorist organization in Gaza, which has openly committed itself to genocide. So the other feature of this inquiry is that the resources that are allotted to it, they are beyond imagination. Instead of occasionally or every year requiring a recommitment to an inquiry of some kind, it has, because it's in perpetuity, it has now created a permanent staff within the UN Human Rights Office, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, and there's also an office in New York. And it will be composed of at least 18 people permanently. And some of them are lawyers dedicated. So it's like they have created an in-house legal office of the United Nations to accuse Israel of criminal acts of criminality, to criminalize the enterprise, in effect, of a Jewish state. So you have, temporary staff for countries like North Korea that are a third of the size than the permanent staff for the state of Israel. So where does that leave us? The mandate, therefore, is clearly biased to begin with, and it required staffing. Who are the members of the inquiry? They appointed 3 individuals who, the president of the Human Rights Council, a Muslim diplomat from Fiji, appointed number 1, Nave Pillay, number 2, Milon Kotari from India, and Chris Sadati from Australia. Now, Pillay, as you may have been familiar with the name, was herself the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights for 6 years. She's infamous for her anti-Israel bias for quite a few reasons. Number 1, she was the world's leading champion of the Durban Conference and the mantra that a Jewish state is a racist state, that Palestinians are victims of Israeli racism, that the only country on earth actually mentioned in a global so-called effort to combat racism was the Jewish state. Pillay designed the second and third iterations of the Durban Conference to reaffirm that messaging in 2009, 2011 during her tenure. Secondly, Pillay is a champion of the Goldstone Report. Even when she was at the forefront of having a Goldstone Report to begin with, in her advocacy in the November and December of 2008. She then went on to, when Goldstone himself retracted the central blood libel of the Israelis deliberately targeting civilians, she refused to admit or acknowledge that his recanting, and on the contrary, became a champion of the Goldstone Report in its original format or a statement. And furthermore, Pillay was the High Commissioner during the 2008-9 war, the 2012, and 2014, in the summer of 2014. And in that context, she released a series of statements about the exact topic of this inquiry. She's investigated it already. She's come to the conclusions. She's issued the recommendations that are required by this inquiry. And so, as some would say, it's done, and done as far as Navi Pillay is concerned. Well, what about the Qatari from India? Well, he's already said things like, I'm just looking for his exact language. If I can find it in 2 seconds flat. He said, for example, that he called the September 2000 suicide bombing efforts between 2000 and the next few years. He called them a wave of Palestinian resistance. He said that Israel, and then he denounced in a UN report, no less, it's not as if they don't know it, Israel's long record of implantation of settlers prior to and since its establishment as a state. So here is an individual who already, he's already alleged ethnic cleansing and so on. So his mind is clearly made up on the very subject matter of the inquiry. Sidoti is the antithesis of independent. He himself is known to be, and this is on, in various, the websites to he himself links on, he is a person who is what he calls a close friend and ally to the Palestinian Commission on Human Rights, which advises the Palestinian Authority on its laws and principles. He's a member, he is he provides legal advice to an NGO, which strategic guidance and advice to an NGO, which itself has already said that supports BDS and talks about the systemic brutality perpetrated through the past 7 decades. So there's no hidden agenda here about 67 or anything like that. It's of Israel's colonialism, apartheid, et cetera, et cetera. So we have 3 people appointed who are the antithesis of the so-called qualifications of the UN of any of their inquiries: independence, impartiality, and objectivity. On another front are the resources that have been assigned this group. Practically unheard of for this kind of inquiry in the history of the United Nations human rights system. Millions of dollars, approximately $10 million to start off with, and approximately $4 to $5 million every year thereafter in perpetuity. Now, it's important to recognize that the American taxpayer, because it's part of the regular budget of the United Nations, is spending 22% of our money funding this inquiry. And the only way that can stop is if Congress is immediately to put in money, withholding the funds to normally for the United Nations from this inquiry. There's only about less than 2
language
weeks.
Withholding language from our next fiscal appropriations bill, right?
From the appropriations bill that will be in the middle of the omnibus bill, or the mini omnibus bills in the middle of February. But it's being negotiated right now. And if you want to do something positive, talk to your member of Congress about how outrageous it is that American taxpayer dollars should be spent in this fashion. The other thing is to understand is it's really, there are recommendations are required from this body. And so in effect, it is a 4-part assault on the state of Israel. Number 1, find Israel responsible for religious repression, in specifically apartheid. Number two, identify the perpetrators, it's said on the website, and those will be sent to the International Criminal Court. You should know that any of you who are listening could be very well named, because it's open-ended, doesn't say Israelis only, could be Americans, British, from wherever you are, could be identified by someone who can put in a submission anonymously as responsible for the protraction of the conflict. Then the third recommendation, the third job description they have is to identify the job of third states. And the idea is that third states will have to be engaged in BDS. So this will be a massive effort to turn BDS into a UN system-wide campaign. And the last is an arms embargo on the state of Israel. Both Qatari and Sadati have in their writings already, their writings are those of their close associates, for which they're directly related, called for a full arms embargo. Why? Well, lest the oppressor be able to defend themselves. So we have a situation where from beginning to end, this is an all-out attack on the efficacy, the legitimacy, the well-being of the state of Israel. And the question we now have is, what can we do about it?
Exactly. Before you go into the steps of what we could do about it, I'd like to ask you a question. And that is, there are certain legal scholars that many of us admire and respect, who have put out the word to the community not to submit submissions to the commission, because they feel that that just provides a fig leaf that will legitimize what is bound to be a kangaroo court. How would you respond to this, Anne?
Well, here's the thing. The inquiry itself specifically asks for submissions. They've put out a call for submissions. They want, in particular, NGOs and so on to participate. Now, the question is, should we participate? We're not talking about the state of Israel. We don't pretend to have any kind of, we're not surrogates. We're not, we don't represent the state of Israel. The question is, what can we do as individuals and Jewish organizations who care about this terrible, appalling exercise? What can we do? And the answer is, there are many different things that we can do. But one of them is to answer this call for submissions. And I say that because in the full knowledge that it's biased, that it will either ignore the submissions or it will twist them until they're unrecognizable. That doesn't mean we ought not to submit. Why? Because submissions is a process of getting out the message, not just to the United Nations, who may ignore it or twist it, but to the world about the truth about Israel, about self-defense, about what international human rights law and humanitarian law actually require, about who's the real racists, and about what anti-Semitism is, about what modern anti-Semitism is, and about what Israel has to go through for over 7 decades to, in fact, defend itself and its people and the well-being of the Jewish people everywhere. So submissions should be accompanied, number one, send them into the United Nations, but then use them, make them public, You can make them public by sending them to me at Human Rights Voices, which I will describe to you in a minute. I'm the president of an NGO called Human Rights Voices, which is at the forefront of this effort. You can do them, you can tweet them out, you can put them on social media of all kinds, you can on Facebook, you can put out a press depending on how formal you are, your means, take out an ad in a newspaper, send them to your members of Congress, put them, have a press conference, have a press release. There are many different ways of you taking write an op-ed, write on a blog, of you using your submissions for advocacy. This ought to be, the submissions forum can be, in fact, in many ways, not what the United Nations has anticipated, not giving them what they want to hear, but giving them A, the truth, and B, educating those around us who are still open to understanding the reality of what's going on in this world. And I think it's terribly important to not to leave the playing field only to the other side. If we put in all those submissions, and I mean tens of thousands of submissions, if we can do that, then, and the United Nations, basically we can script the entire report as it now, it's due out in June, the first report, and then another report in the fall, and then twice a year, every year thereafter. Since we know what Pele's already said, and they've already written their views, when they ignore what you and I and others on this call will have to, in our organizations and other individuals have to say, it gives us the opportunity to point to the fact that they had this information. It's not as if they didn't know. This is what they ignored. These are the facts and the details and the legal stances that are not reflected in the report that could have been and weren't. So it serves us in many different ways, as an education tool, as an advocacy tool, as a way of criticizing it when it does see the light of day.
So they are under no obligation to include our submissions in their report. Is that
Well, it's very important not to be under any illusions that you're going to put in a submission and find yourself quoted. I mean, this is not a way to fame and glory.
Not fame and glory.
In the UN context.
To influence
their mind is made up. We can assume it's made up. Not only is it made up, they may very well take whatever you say and twist it beyond recognition. So you have to be prepared for that too, but you know what you said. You have the supporting data, and you can respond accordingly. I think what's very important to understand is this. You don't have to be an expert. I mean, people get nervous. They think, I don't really know, exactly what happened in situation ABC and so on. But that's not what submissions have to look like. Submissions can be, I'll just back up here. In their call for submissions, they give 5 different baskets under which you can make a submission. And you have to preface every submission by saying it relates to one or more of those baskets. Those baskets are everything. I read you, every human rights abuse or human rights violation in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. So every example of anti-Semitism you can come up with. Every perpetrator, by the way, it asks one basket is in identification of the perpetrators. Well, it doesn't take you very long to think of how to identify the perpetrators. And what about the perpetrators in American context? The ones who distort, misrepresent, use the Arab-Israeli conflict to promote anti-Semitism, modern anti-Semitism. They contribute to the protraction of the conflict, because they energize people wrongly to foment anti-Semitism, and that very incitement contributes to the protraction in the name of combating Israeli so-called offenses, and that contributes to the protraction of the conflict. So it's wide open. You just refer specifically to one of the 5 categories, and we will give you the tools to be able to do that. I can have a template. I can show you what the 5.
Right. Just walk us through. And I really want our audience to know you do not have to be the head of an NGO. They also say individuals. So anybody can make a submission.
It literally can be anybody. It can be a student on campus who's experienced misrepresentation of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and organizations dedicated to such a misrepresentation and incitement to violence. It can be people who are stuck at home with COVID. It can be as simple as pointing to one of the 5 and saying, in a picture of a bus, of a suicide bombed out bus where Israelis were murdered, and a statement. This contributes to the protraction of the conflict, the never-ending war to destroy Jews and the Jewish state. That's it. That's a submission. It can be a video you saw that you think is about the topic. It can be a newspaper article that you read that relates to the subject. It can be. It's completely open-ended. And one other thing to note, and that is, I don't know whether the person who's helping us on screen share can possibly bring something up.
Naomi.
Can I ask you to bring up the submissions website? Okay, so this is my website, and I will send you the link to it. And if you scroll down, you can find out the mandate, the budget. Now, just before we click on submissions, you can object to the mandate. Just read it, copy it, send it in. What's the matter with it? You can, or if we go back, and we can talk about the inquiry members. If you scroll down, and I will be adding to this. I've got them there. I've got the quotes. I've got the links to all the what's the matter with and how biased they are. So you can talk about that. If we go to submissions now, I have this website. It tells you why make a submission, what the deadline is. We're looking to try to find submissions by the end of February so that they have no excuse that they didn't have time to consider them, because that's the point. When they aren't reflected, we want to be able to, in terms of how many submissions you make, there's no reason for an NGO or an organization to sit around and have 25 committee meetings on what you can all agree about, or we can all agree. We can, hundreds of organizations can all meet together over and over and over again to talk about one submission. Absolutely unnecessary. The more, the better. We don't have to agree with each other about the stylistically and so on. So what about who should submit? As you can tell, I said victims of modern anti-Semitism, victims of Palestinian terror, Jewish organizations, campus groups, teachers, students, synagogue groups, interfaith groups, Birthright alum, day school students, people from all walks of life. There are no pre-qualifications. If you carry on down, I have a list of the topics, and I give you examples of the kinds of things you might want to write about. But let's go down a little bit farther to how to submit, if I could. I gave you tips of submissions. By the way, if you look at the tips, it need not be new. It's something you already read, a term paper you already wrote, a speech you already gave. Don't assume confidentiality. You don't have to give your name, but you can't assume that the United Nations is going to keep you secret. So now if you're looking at where to send, I'm going to show you what the UN suggests. Let's click on this thing, iCloud. Okay. Now, there we are. We're not going to click anything more. This is a star chamber. This is the cloud, okay, facility. If we can click back on it again, it's not going to submit on its own. You can, it says anonymous upload. And all you have to do is put your file or whatever it is in there and push send. Now let's go back to the page before. And it says there, it says, they will not acknowledge, I'm quoting their words, not acknowledge receipt of submissions. So can you imagine that? If you scroll up a little bit more to the topics, topic number 3, if you just keep going a little bit higher, there it is. Stop. No, keep going down. There it is. Identification, those are their words, identification of those responsible. So imagine that. You can go to an anonymous website and name any Jew that you think contributes to the, humanitarian problems, human rights abuses, is a pro-Israel, what they would consider pro-Israel advocate, has ever traveled to the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, has ever gone on the road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem that they claim is illegitimate, has ever contributed to a fund of any kind. In fact, Kutari says, he talks about root causes. He points specifically to the, in his words, the, just give me 1 second because it's important to understand this, how he says, the root causes, the colonization activities of the World Zionist Organization and the Jewish National Fund. So that's what they're going to identify. So if you've been involved in anything like that, you have no idea whether somebody's going to put your name in. So turn it on its head. There's my suggestions. Child educators teaching hate, parents who send their children into harm's way. All the pay for slay recipients, all the examples of Palestinian officials and representatives who incite hate and religious intolerance. The reporters of anti-Semitic tape. It goes on and on. Okay, so if you scroll down a little bit more, the other thing I would say is just down to the keep going here. Yeah, I said it's important, therefore, not to only use the cloud because they won't acknowledge the receipt of it, and you won't have any record that you did it. So I've given you an email address there. There's an email address from the UN. COI is the Commission of Inquiry on the OPT, which they consider to be the Occupied Palestinian Territory and East Jerusalem, okay? So there's an address, there's an email address. Send it to an email address in addition to sending it to the cloud so that you have a record of you sending it in. And lastly, I would suggest sending it to me. Or you could send it to Sarah and she could start collecting them. But if she doesn't want to do that, I have a contact page link there, and you can send it to us. We will keep a record of them. If you want to be confidential, you don't have to give us a name or so on. Just put in what you sent, tell me that you sent it, and we'll keep a record of it. And so when they ignore it and we get all of these submissions, we will be able to use it to criticize the results. So does that answer your question?
Absolutely. So I just would like to reiterate all of this information is there on a wonderful website that you've developed. It's www.humanrightsvoices.org. And
even if you remember only that, you go to the link at the top, it says Pele's
all there.
pogrom.
It is very, very clear.
Yeah, and I call it pogrom because it is a pogrom. It's lethal. It's not just hot air. If Israel can't defend itself, obviously Jews are going to die. Jews and other Israelis also, of course. And it's incitement. to more violence, because what the UN is doing is serving as a platform, A, platform, and B, the fact that genocidal crusaders, I shouldn't use the word crusaders, genocidal organizations, terrorist organizations, can call on the United Nations to create such an inquiry in response to their deliberate attempts to violate human rights, encourages more violation of human rights. So yes, so it's a pogrom. Pillay is the chair. That's why I've called it that. So you can go to the main page of the website and click on it and get everything you need.
Great. And now it's my honor to turn the podium over to our wonderful director of AMET's program of Democratic Voices coming out of the Middle East, Hussein Abubakar Mansour. Hussein?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you very much, Anne, for such an amazing and wonderful presentation. We've received a lot of questions. And by the way, we use a lot of your material and the things that you write actually in our own meetings on Capitol Hill. Me and Sarah and Gabe have been daily having meetings on Capitol Hill about this specific issue, and we use a lot of your own analysis. So we want to thank you for the amazing work that you do, and we've received a lot of messages thanking you for this. Now, for all our audience who sent us questions about all of this information, if you are registered on our mailing list, and if you're here, I assume that you are, you will receive an email after the webinar with the recording of the webinar and the website that we just used for this information. So you can go back to that and follow the instructions on the site. Let me start with a few questions, because you already answered a lot of requests that were received about the technicalities of how do I do this, how do people, if people want to get in touch with you, they can contact you through the website, correct?
Yes, they can. The contact page, you can send me any note you want to.
Amazing. So I believe that most of the technical questions are now answered. I'm gonna move to the other questions that we've received. About the Human Rights Council itself. This is not, of course, the first time. It's a very long record. How come that no other democratic member countries of the UN find this unacceptable? People, of course, are morally outraged that this is happening in a supposedly international body, that it gets funded from us, that has memberships, legitimating memberships from democratic Western countries. Why is everybody accepting this kind of behavior?
Okay, I'm going to the vote of the Human Rights Council when they voted on the resolution to create the inquiry. It was 24 in favor, 9 against, and 14 abstentions. Among the 24 in favor was not a single solitary Western democracy. So it's not true that they were all for it. That's false. Should there have been more countries voting against? Yes. I mean, I'm not sure why Italy, France, for example, they ought to be embarrassed that they simply abstained. Same with the Netherlands and Ukraine, Poland, etc. But voting against was the Austria, Czech Republic, Germany, United Kingdom, and others. The United States wasn't on the Human Rights Council. And so that it, and even if it were, it would have been 24 in favor, 10 against. So, but the bottom line is that this was driven by the request to have a special session, and the drafting of the resolution was done by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the so-called State of Palestine. So they're behind it. That's what did it. Now, then you may ask, well, what about the funding of it? The funding came to the United Nations General Assembly at the end of December, and they decided to fund it. Israel put forward an amendment to deleting the funding from the UN's regular budget, and the only country that supported it was the United States. I mean, there were a few, but basically the United States. And that's unfortunate. there were abstentions and so on. But the reason for that is because how the UN system works. It's you vote against the creation or abstain on the creation of something, but then when it comes to paying for it, you think, I mean, you being most democracies think, well, I lost, but that's the way the UN works. I got to pay for it, because then when I want to have a actual inquiry on some such country, then people will vote, or countries will vote against my preferred inquiry. So this, of course, is a twisted way of thinking, because since when is the inequality of the Jewish state a price worth paying for supposed concern about other states? I mean, you know, I thought that sort of the back of the bus syndrome was debunked by now, and that's the way the UN system operates. It's simply, it's wrong. What can I say? But it's how it works. It doesn't mean, however, that now that the giving up on the vote at the General Assembly is the end of the story, because each of these countries has their own budgetary system, their own legislatures, which have to approve of funding in one way or another. So the fact that their governments, representatives or the diplomats thought it was uncomfortable or a nuisance to vote against funding at the General Assembly ought not to be the final word in terms of individuals living in those countries and representatives and the Jewish communities and the pro-Israel communities and I don't really like that term. I mean, you're not pro or anti-Israel. You're just trying to do the right thing. But the Christian communities, for example, can, I think, make a difference in communicating with their representatives that this is not okay, that they want to see this money withheld from their country's contribution to the regular budget of the United Nations. And I think that that campaign ought to be mounted in every democratic country around the world. So right. It's not over, but so that's the long-winded answer.
Thank you. Did any of the Abraham Accords countries vote for this resolution?
The Abraham Accords have had absolutely no effect whatsoever at the United Nations. I mean, it's not how the UN works. The UN, they have different communities that they consider to be take priority, and they don't think there's a price to be paid. I mean, the United States has strong allies that refuse to vote with the United States over and over again at the United Nations. And it doesn't affect our bilateral relations at all. So
I'd like to actually jump in there for a minute, because I've had the honor and privilege of serving on the board of directors of another organization, Ajiri, founded by the late wonderful Ambassador Richard Shifter, who has been trying, and Ajiri is trying, he tried during his lifetime to use the quid pro quo system of, you know, working with presidents and prime ministers through, you know, and I was working with members of Congress to contact them who had absolutely no idea how their representatives in Turtle Bay were voting, you know, in the United Nations were voting, and we, you know, let them know, you know, we give a lot of appropriations to many of these countries that vote against the United States and Israel. And I just like to give a plug to Ajiri for their, I mean, and they are trying really, really hard to slowly change these negative votes, you know, to neutral votes and or abstentions, and the abstentions to positive votes for Israel, or, you know, vice versa against Israel. So I'm sorry about that. I just had to, because they've been working very, very hard on this issue. I'm sorry.
Another question is Israel, the state of Israel, fighting back, and how is it fighting back?
I don't speak for the government of Israel. I think it's in Israel, of course, in the fall, when the resolution from the Human Rights Council, the formal procedure in the UN is you have a resolution of the Human Rights Council that's embodied in a report of the Human Rights Council. The report goes to the UN General Assembly. The UN General Assembly then adopts the report of the Human Rights Council. And in the latter context at the United Nations, the ambassador of Israel, Gilad Erdan, stood up on the podium of the General Assembly. And as you may or may not recall, the infamous circumstance where Herzog went to the top of the podium of the General Assembly when Zionism is racism was going to be adopted, and tore it up, saying very dramatically and indicating the obscenity of such a resolution, and what the government of Israel would be treating it as such. Ambassador Erdan, for the second time in Israeli history, did that with the resolution, tore it up in front of the General Assembly when it was being incorporated or adopted in the context of the Human Rights Council report. So Israel will not directly cooperate in any way, shape, or form, not directly or indirectly. They're not cooperating. They're not recognizing the legitimacy of the exercise. They attempted to, as I say, ensure that it was not funded, but knowing that there is a group of countries in the United Nations that controls the outcomes, and in many ways, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation rules the roost. So, but since that time, I think that I think Israel is I think you'd have to ask them as to what they are or aren't doing programmatically to combat the terrible lie, this abomination.
Maybe this is then a good time to, I'm going to combine a lot of questions, but basically a lot of people send comments and questions sounding kind of a cynicism or skepticism from the utility of engaging with this committee at all. If this is the formation of the committee, if this is what they're going to do, is it really going to make a difference for pro-Israel activists to try to engage with them? And maybe I'll also add another question to this. If you do believe that, which obviously we already saw you encouraging people to engage with them, but if they engage, can you using memory provided information and videos as part of the facts or the submissions, would that be effective, or do you recommend that?
Okay, first of all, engaging is really not the right word because it's like, it's a black hole. Remember, you saw the picture, anonymous, with this cloud thing with a statement that it won't be acknowledged. So nobody, unless they're secretly calling friends that they want to solicit things from, which is not impossible, and so on. And much of the language that was drafted in the resolution itself was actually presaged in reports and press releases of Human Rights Watch. So there is obviously a clear relationship between the operators, between the anti-Israel NGOs and the commission itself, the inquiry members, and quite possibly the staff of the Human Rights Council, of the Office of the High Commissioner. After all, they're hiring 18 people. Who are they hiring? And we won't know, or at least not knowing now. And I imagine none of you have got an application, I would imagine. So so you're not really going to engage. What you're going to engage with is the public opinion. You're going to use your submission as a means to say, I was involved, I cared about it, I think this is a diametrically opposed to the purposes of the United Nations, the so-called human rights of the Human Rights Council, the sort of the raison d'etre of the institution. I think that this is biased, unfair, and anti-Semitic, and here's why. And then you're going to take what you say to the world and use it to do advocacy, just to get the word out. Send it to me. If you don't want to do anything at all, send it to me. I will put it on a list and make sure that the fact that you cared and you bothered, if you want your name to be used. If not, I can just say another submission came in on date, whatever. But so that you add your name to the list of people that are not taking this lying down. Silence is not an answer to this inquiry. This is one of those situations where it's a terrible, terrible outcome that awaits. This is not, the 1920 resolutions that the UN General Assembly adopts every year condemning the state of Israel. This is operationalizing the International Criminal Court against IDF soldiers and the democratically elected members of the Knesset, of the judiciary in Israel, the rule of law. This is operationalizing BDS on a global level, giving it the sanction of the entire global community for BDS. So that, up until now, there's some loony down the road who, goes to campus. It doesn't mean we oughtn't to fight back, but, it has been, we can point to, we have up until now not been terribly effective. I shouldn't say that. There have been important efforts to counter the BDS initiative in various states and all of that. But the United Nations General Assembly then adopts the resolution of the Human Rights Council calling for BDS. Don't you think that that's going to go before the next hearing in a legislature or before a court? When a third party says, they'll say, well, the General Assembly said. Now in America, that has less impact because Americans are generally suspicious of the legitimacy of the United Nations, given that the majority are non-democracies, given the demonization of the United States at the UN, let alone Israel. But that's not true of other countries, not European countries and others. So it's terribly important to add your voice and to loud and clear. It's about time that this became a massive grassroots effort, and I urge you to be a part of it.
Thank you so much. And we are coming to a close. First of all, I would like people to support Anne's wonderful work. Anne has her own NGO, Human Rights Voices, .org.com, which she has put up on the screen.
.org.
.org. Thank you. And I please, help keep her work alive. I'd also like to follow this up for everyone who is registered with some informational papers. Anne and I had a discussion earlier, and as she has informed me, 22% of the budget for this is coming from the American taxpayer. We can each write to our member of Congress. There has been language in the appropriations bill trying to take away funding for anything from the United Nations that actually demonizes Israel and the Jewish people. And we could send you that language. It should be inserted once again. Annette does have a few letters right now circulating on Congress, and one of them has to do with this, and we could send you a copy of this letter. And we would like your members of Congress to sign on. So we will follow up to those who have registered today with some more information, you know, and not to take a stand is to take a stand. And, you know, we can no longer afford to be the new Jews of silence. So
if I could just add one thing, as I wanted to correct perhaps when Israel asked on the funding front, when Israel asked, put forward an amendment to reject General Assembly regular budget funding for the this Commission of Inquiry, it was there were 8 countries that voted with Israel, including Hungary, including the United States. There were others, and 35 countries abstained. So those countries at least did not register approval of funding. And so, you know, I would urge on the United Kingdom, Germany, and so on, Australia, Canada, those countries, I think, are also would be open to the idea that that funding should be withheld, even if they're paying the rest of their UN dues. And the other thing to remember about this is that the United States, the current government, has decided to join the Human Rights Council. This whole conversation we've had has been bipartisan and apolitical, let's say. But I think there ought to be bipartisan support for withholding money for this exercise, and in the recognition of how anti-Semitic and anti-Israel it really is. But I would say that this came out of the Human Rights Council, and the Biden administration has decided to legitimize the council by the membership of the world's leading democratic state. They think that they can make changes. This report will come in June. There'll be a resolution welcoming the report. That resolution, we can tell you right now, is going to pass. And the United States will be one of X number of countries that will vote against, and they will lose. So when losing is a foregone conclusion, as a state, one has to question the legitimacy of joining the Human Rights Council and giving it a stature that it doesn't deserve. Now, the Biden administration is committed to changing that at the Human Rights Council. They will shortly discover this coming March, when the first session happens since they joined, that reform is impossible. They don't have the numbers. It's a numbers game. That's just the way the UN is. The United States has one vote, along with countries that have a population of 50,000 people. So I hope that they recognize this sooner rather than later, and refuse to legitimize the vehicle for delegitimizing the Jewish state.
Thank you so much, Anne. This was very, very informative, and we will follow it up to everyone who's registered. And please spread this knowledge to all of your family and friends so that they too can submit submissions, and also, to talk to your member of Congress about refusing to appropriate the funding for this kind of demonization of our one democratic ally in the Middle East, the State of Israel. Thank you so much. Our time is just about up. I've been told by my board that we also need to request funding for the incredibly difficult work that we do every single day. So if you would like to also fund AMET, please go to www.ametonline.org to help us to continue with this programming and with our efforts to educate members of Congress about what is moral and what is right and what they should be doing with our taxpayers' dollars. Thank you very much.